The distant mountains cast long shadows across the barren landscape as Thomas Blackwood guided his horse through the narrow canyon. 30 years of ranching in Arizona territory had hardened him against most horrors, but nothing could prepare him for what awaited in the shallow ravine ahead. The setting sun painted the rock walls in blood-red hues when a faint whimper caught his attention. Thomas dismounted, his weathered hand resting instinctively on the Colt revolver at his hip. Following the sound, he discovered a crude wooden cage partially hidden beneath a juniper tree. Inside, a small Apache child sat huddled, her vacant eyes staring into nothingness. A crude sign hung from the bars. She heard too much. "Dear Lord," Thomas whispered, kneeling beside the cage. The girl couldn't be more than 7 years old, with dirt-caked hair and cracked lips from dehydration. Her eyes, though open, didn't track his movement. She was blind. Rage bubbled in Thomas's chest as he examined the padlock. He'd fought in the war between the states, had seen men die in horrific ways, but the deliberate cruelty against a helpless child struck him to his core. With a swift strike from a nearby rock, he shattered the lock and gently opened the door. "It's all right, little one," he said softly, though he knew she likely didn't understand English. "I won't hurt you." Friends, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from today? The child flinched at his touch, but was too weak to resist when Thomas carefully lifted her from the cage. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, bones prominent beneath her tattered dress. Thomas removed his canteen, helping her take small sips of water. Who would do such a thing? And what had she heard that warranted such cruelty? As he wrapped her in his coat, Thomas scanned the surroundings. The cage hadn't been there yesterday when he'd ridden this trail. This was fresh wickedness, and the perpetrators couldn't be far. Thomas settled the child on his horse and mounted behind her. Rattlesnake Ranch was still a 2-hour ride, but his wife Sarah would know what to do. Though childless themselves, Sarah had been a nurse during the war and had a gentle way with children. The little Apache girl leaned back against him as they rode, her small body gradually relaxing as exhaustion overcame fear. Thomas's mind raced with questions. The sign suggested she had overheard something dangerous enough that someone wanted to silence her permanently without outright killing her. The sun had fully set by the time the ranch house came into view, its windows glowing with the warm light of oil lamps. Thomas's ranch hand, Hector Rodriguez, emerged from the barn as they approached. "Mr. Blackwood, we were getting worried." Hector stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening at the sight of the child. "Madre de Dios, what happened?" Before Thomas could explain, Sarah appeared on the porch, her silhouette framed by the doorway. One look at her husband's face and the bundle in his arms told her something was terribly wrong. "She needs water, food, and clean clothes," Thomas explained after carrying the child inside. Sarah asked no questions as she set to work, gently cleaning the girl's face and arms with a warm cloth. Thomas recounted how he had found her while Hector stood by the door, his expression grave. "I've heard rumors," Hector said quietly. "There's talk of new silver discovered on Apache land, rich deposits that some men in Copper Springs would kill for." Thomas nodded solemnly. The pieces were beginning to fit together. If certain men were planning to drive the Apache from their treaty-protected lands, a child witness would be inconvenient. The next morning, Thomas stood on his porch, watching the sunrise, coffee cup in hand. He had barely slept, his mind troubled by the previous day's discovery. Sarah had stayed up most of the night with the child, who had finally fallen asleep in their spare bedroom. "She's fevered, but stronger than she looks," Sarah reported, joining him. "I tried speaking to her in the little Apache I know from the mission school. Her name is Nasha. It means owl in their language." Thomas nodded, wondering what kind of world they lived in, where children were discarded like unwanted animals. "And Thomas," Sarah added, her voice dropping, "I don't think she was born blind." The implications of Sarah's words hung heavy in the morning air. "You mean someone?" Thomas couldn't finish the sentence, the rage building again in his chest. Sarah nodded grimly. "Burns," she said simply. "Someone wanted to make sure she couldn't identify them. But she can still speak, Thomas. Whatever she heard, she can still tell it." Thomas set his cup down with such force that coffee spilled onto the wooden boards of the porch. For 20 years, he had minded his own business in this harsh country. He had avoided the frequent conflicts between settlers and the Apache, had steered clear of the corrupt politics of the growing territories. But this was different. Some lines couldn't be crossed. By midday, Thomas had made his decision. "I'm riding to Fort Apache," he told Sarah as he packed supplies. "They have a translator there who can help us understand what she knows. Then we'll take her back to her people." Sarah looked doubtful. "The army isn't always kind to the Apache, Thomas. Are you sure that's wise?" Thomas buckled his saddlebags with a determined tug. "I know Captain McGregor. He's a fair man. And frankly, Sarah, I need to know what this child heard that was worth such cruelty. Because whoever did this is still out there." What Thomas didn't say was that he intended to make them pay, one way or another. Fort Apache sat perched on a mesa overlooking the high desert, its flag visible for miles around. Thomas arrived as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the parade ground. Captain James McGregor, a former Union officer with whom Thomas had maintained a cautious friendship, received him in the command office. "This is a serious accusation, Blackwood," McGregor said after hearing the story. "You're suggesting prominent men in Copper Springs may be plotting to violate the treaty?" Thomas nodded grimly. "I'm not suggesting anything, Jim. I'm telling you what I found. That child was caged like an animal because of something she heard. I aim to find out what." McGregor sighed, removing his spectacles to polish them methodically. "The situation with the Apache is already tense. Chief Diablo's band has been raiding again. 3 homesteads hit in the last month." Thomas leaned forward. "And has anyone asked why? Maybe they know something about these silver rumors." The captain replaced his glasses, his expression unreadable. "I'll send Lieutenant Carey with you. He speaks Apache better than our regular translator. But Thomas," he added, lowering his voice, "be careful. Silver makes men do terrible things. And not everyone at this fort is as concerned with justice as you and I." Thomas nodded, understanding the warning. The territories were still wild, and the line between law and lawlessness was often blurred by greed. Lieutenant Michael Carey proved to be younger than Thomas expected, barely into his 20s, with an earnest face that seemed out of place in the harsh environment. "Captain says you found an Apache child," he said as they rode side by side toward Rattlesnake Ranch. Thomas studied the young man, trying to gauge his character. "That's right. She's blind, deliberately blinded. According to my wife, someone went to great lengths to silence her without killing her outright." The lieutenant frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Why not just—" He stopped himself. "Sorry, That's a horrible thing to say. Thomas nodded grimly. I've been asking myself the same question. Why keep her alive at all? Unless they wanted to send a message. When they arrived at the ranch, they found Sarah on the porch with Nasha beside her. The child had been cleaned and dressed in clothes that hung loose on her small frame. Though she couldn't see their approach, she turned her head at the sound of hoofbeats, her posture instantly tense. It's all right, Sarah reassured her in halting Apache. It's just Thomas returning. Lieutenant Carey dismounted slowly, and Thomas noted how he kept his movements quiet and deliberate as he approached. Hello, little one, Carey said in fluent Apache. My name is Michael. I'm a friend. The girl tilted her head, listening intently, but said nothing. Over the next hour, Carey patiently coaxed words from Nasha, translating her halting responses for Thomas and Sarah. She says she's from Chief Diablo's band, Carey explained. She was gathering plants with her grandmother near the creek when she heard men talking. White men. Thomas leaned forward. What were they saying? Carey asked more questions, waiting through long silences before Nasha would respond. She says they spoke of shiny rocks and papers with the Great Father's mark. That would be the president, I assume. They talked about paying someone called the Judge to make new papers that would move her people from their land. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. Judge Monroe, Sarah said quietly. He's the territorial judge in Copper Springs. Thomas nodded, the pieces falling into place. Did she recognize any voices? Carey asked the question, but shook his head before Nasha could even respond. She says she never saw their faces, but one man smelled of the water that burns, whiskey, I'd guess, and flowers. Sarah frowned. Flowers? Carey nodded. Probably cologne. Few men out here use it, which might help identify him. Thomas stood up, pacing the small room, and after she heard this, Carey's expression darkened after Nasha's next words. They caught her. Her grandmother tried to protect her, but He paused. They killed the old woman. Then a man held Nasha down, while another used a hot iron on her eyes, saying it would ensure she couldn't identify them. That night, after Carey had retired to the guest room and Nasha had finally fallen asleep, Thomas sat with Sarah at their kitchen table. Judge Monroe, the treaty, silver deposits, Thomas mused, connecting the threads. If someone found silver on Apache land, they'd need the treaty redrawn to get at it legally. Sarah nodded. And Judge Monroe has the authority to recommend changes to Indian treaties, doesn't he? Thomas's expression was grim. Yes, but he'd need a reason, like continued Apache raids on settlements. Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. So if someone wanted to provoke the Apache into violence, Thomas finished her thought, they'd have a pretext for removing them from their land. And what better way to provoke them than by torturing and abandoning one of their children? The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Thomas was checking the irrigation ditches when he spotted 3 riders approaching from the direction of Copper Springs. He recognized the lead rider immediately, William Forsythe, owner of the largest general store in town and a man rumored to have political ambitions. The 2 men flanking him were strangers to Thomas, but their hard eyes and the way they carried their rifles told him all he needed to know. Hired guns. Thomas casually adjusted his position so that his own rifle was within reach as the riders approached. "Morning, Blackwood," Forsythe called out, his voice falsely cheerful. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "What brings you out this way, Forsythe?" Thomas replied, not bothering with pleasantries. "You're a long way from your store." Forsythe dismounted, brushing dust from his expensive coat, a coat that seemed unnecessarily formal for the frontier. As he came closer, Thomas caught the distinct smell of cologne, floral cologne. "Actually, I'm here on official business," Forsyth said, producing a folded document from his breast pocket. "Judge Monroe has appointed me special envoy to investigate the recent Apache raids. We've received reports that you might have information, or perhaps even be harboring one of them." Thomas kept his expression neutral, though his heart hammered in his chest. How had they learned about Nasha so quickly? "I'm not harboring anyone, Forsyth. This is my land, and who I welcome on it is my business." Thomas made no move to take the proffered document. Forsyth's smile tightened. "The law says different, Blackwood. We have reason to believe a member of Chief Diablo's band is on your property, a band responsible for killing 3 families last month." One of Forsyth's companions shifted in his saddle, hand moving subtly toward his holstered pistol. Thomas noted the movement, but maintained his focus on Forsyth. "If you have questions, take them to Fort Apache. Captain McGregor is handling all matters regarding the Apache." Forsyth's eyes narrowed slightly. "We've already been to the fort. Interesting that Lieutenant Carey seems to be missing. His fellow officers thought he might be here." Thomas felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. Carey's presence at the ranch wasn't widely known. Someone at Fort Apache had informed on them. "I don't know what you're talking about, Forsyth. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He turned deliberately, presenting his back to the 3 men in a calculated risk. If they meant to shoot him, they'd do it now. The tense silence stretched for several heartbeats before Forsyth spoke again. "We'll be back, Blackwood, with more men and proper authority. Whatever misguided sympathy you have for savages isn't worth your life, or your wife's." The threat, thinly veiled, hung in the air as the 3 men remounted and rode away. Thomas waited until the riders were specks on the horizon before hurrying back to the house. Inside, he found Sarah, Lieutenant Carey, and Hector gathered in the kitchen, their expressions tense. "They know she's here," Thomas said without preamble. "Forsyth as much as admitted it." Sarah's hand went to her throat. "William Forsyth? But he's on the town council. Surely he wouldn't—" Thomas cut her off. "He would, and he did. I smelled that flower cologne on him, Sarah. And he had papers from Judge Monroe himself." Carey stood up, his young face hardened by concern. "We need to move Nasha immediately. If they come back with more men—" "They will," Hector interjected. "Forsyth doesn't make idle threats, and he has connections all over the territory." Thomas nodded in agreement. "We'll take her to her people. Chief Diablo needs to know what these men are planning." Sarah looked alarmed. "Thomas, that's too dangerous. The Army considers Diablo hostile. If you're caught helping the Apache—" Thomas took his wife's hands. "Sarah, if we do nothing, Forsyth and his kind will manufacture a war to steal land that rightfully belongs to the Apache. More children will suffer like Nasha. I can't stand by and let that happen." The room fell silent as each person contemplated the dangerous path ahead. The plan came together quickly. Thomas would take Nasha to a location near Diablo's camp with Lieutenant Carey as translator. Hector would create a false trail leading north, while Sarah would remain at the ranch to maintain appearances. As Thomas prepared the horses, Carey approached him with a troubled expression. "Blackwood, there's something you should know," the young officer said quietly. "The raids attributed to Chief Diablo. I've had my doubts about them for some time. The victims were all homesteaders who refused to sell their claims to a certain mining consortium, a consortium that Judge Monroe has invested in heavily." Thomas paused in tightening a saddle strap. You're saying the raids were staged? Carrie nodded grimly. I believe so, and I believe Forsyth is involved, but I haven't been able to prove it. They set out at dusk, using the gathering darkness for cover. Nasha rode with Thomas, her small hands gripping his arm with surprising strength. Though she couldn't see the rugged landscape around them, she seemed to sense the danger of their mission. Carrie led the way, following game trails and dry creek beds to avoid the main paths where they might be intercepted. The full moon rose over the mountains, casting the desert in silver light that made Thomas nervous. They were exposed out here, and Forsyth's men could be anywhere. How much farther? Thomas asked, as they paused to rest the horses in a sheltered arroyo. Carrie consulted a small map by moonlight. Diablo's band was last reported in the high country east of Whitewater Canyon. If they've stayed there, we should reach them by dawn. Thomas nodded, watching as Nasha tilted her head, listening to the night sounds around them. Despite her blindness, she seemed more attuned to their surroundings than either man. Suddenly, she stiffened, turning her face toward the ridge above them. What is it? Thomas asked, instantly alert, before Carrie could translate. The crack of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon, and the lieutenant fell from his horse with a cry of pain. Thomas reacted instinctively, pulling Nasha from the saddle and taking cover behind a boulder. Carrie lay motionless in the open, blood darkening his uniform jacket. More shots rang out, splintering rock near Thomas's head. Stay down, he whispered to Nasha, who needed no translation to understand the danger. Thomas drew his rifle and peered cautiously around the edge of the boulder. He counted at least 3 muzzle flashes on the ridge. Forsyth and his men must have followed them despite Hector's false trail. Thomas fired back, not aiming to hit, but to provide cover as he considered their options. They were pinned down, outnumbered, and Carrie needed medical attention. As Thomas contemplated their dire situation, a new sound cut through the gunfire. War cries from the darkness behind their attackers. The shots from the ridge faltered, then redirected away from Thomas's position. The night erupted with chaotic shouts and more gunfire. Taking advantage of the confusion, Thomas darted out to drag Carrie's body to safety behind the boulder. The lieutenant was alive but unconscious, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. Above them, the firefight intensified briefly, then fell suddenly silent. Thomas held his breath, rifle trained on the ridge, with Nasha pressed against his side. Minutes later, a voice called down in Apache. Nasha responded immediately, calling back in the same language. Thomas remained tense until figures appeared at the edge of the arroyo. Apache warriors, their faces painted for battle. One stepped forward, his bearing marking him as a leader. Chief Diablo, Thomas realized, slowly lowering his weapon. The Apache chief regarded Thomas with piercing eyes, then looked to Nasha, speaking rapidly. Though Thomas couldn't understand the words, the emotion behind them was clear. Relief and rage mingled together. Nasha responded at length, her voice stronger than Thomas had yet heard it. When she finished, Chief Diablo turned to Thomas. "She says you saved her," he said in surprisingly good English. "She says men want our land for the shining rocks." Dawn found them in Diablo's camp, hidden in a box canyon that even experienced Army scouts would have difficulty locating. Lieutenant Carey had been treated by the tribe's medicine woman, and now sat propped against a rock wall, pale but alert. Thomas had spent the night explaining everything they had learned, with Carey translating when necessary. Now Chief Diablo sat with them in council, his face grave. These men who hurt Nasha, who won our land, They are the same who attack homesteaders and blame my people? Thomas nodded. We believe so. They need a reason to break the treaty, to force your people off the land where silver has been discovered. Diablo considered this, his weathered face revealing nothing. And what would you have me do, rancher? If we fight, they call us savages and send soldiers. If we do not fight, they take our land anyway. Thomas leaned forward earnestly. We need evidence, Chief. Evidence that will stand in a territorial court. With Lieutenant Carey's testimony and Nasha's story, we can expose Forsyth and Judge Monroe. But we need more. We need to catch them in the act. Diablo's eyes narrowed. You ask much, rancher. My people have little reason to trust white man's justice. Thomas couldn't argue with that assessment. I'm not asking you to trust white man's justice. I'm asking you to help me create justice where none exists. The plan that emerged was dangerous, but simple. Rumors would be spread that Chief Diablo was willing to negotiate a new agreement, one that would relocate his people away from the disputed territory. Judge Monroe and Forsyth would be invited to a meeting at neutral ground. Meanwhile, Thomas would ensure that the territorial governor and honest army officials were secretly present to witness any illegal proposals. It was a gamble that relied on the greed of corrupt men, but it was their best chance to expose the conspiracy without bloodshed. Before they departed, Nasha approached Thomas, guided by another child. Through Carey, she spoke her gratitude and her determination. She says her eyes see nothing, but her ears hear truth. Carey translated, she will speak this truth to any who will listen. 2 weeks later, Thomas stood at the edge of Rattlesnake Creek, where it formed the boundary of his ranch. The spot had been chosen carefully, close enough to town for Judge Monroe and Forsyth to attend without suspicion, yet isolated enough for their true intentions to be revealed. Chief Diablo and 3 warriors waited on the opposite bank, their expressions impassive. Thomas had arranged everything meticulously. The territorial governor, a former judge with a reputation for incorruptibility, was concealed in a hunting blind upstream with 2 federal marshals. Captain McGregor, who had been horrified by Carey's injuries and the conspiracy the lieutenant had uncovered, waited with a small detachment of trusted soldiers out of sight in the cottonwoods. Judge Monroe and Forsyth arrived precisely at noon, accompanied by the 2 hired guns Thomas had seen before. Thomas noted with disgust how Forsyth had dressed for the occasion in another expensive suit, complete with the floral cologne that had become a marker of his villainy. Blackwood, Monroe acknowledged coldly, I still don't understand your involvement in this matter. Indian affairs are hardly the concern of a cattle rancher. Thomas met the judge's gaze steadily. When children are tortured on my land, I make it my concern, Your Honor. Monroe frowned, glancing at Forsyth, who maintained a neutral expression. I don't know what wild stories you've been listening to, but I'm here at the governor's request to discuss legitimate treaty adjustments. The meeting proceeded, with Chief Diablo stating his terms through a translator, an army sergeant selected by Captain McGregor for his integrity. As expected, Judge Monroe countered with proposals that would remove the Apache from the silver-rich land. Then, believing they were speaking privately, Forsyth pulled the judge aside, but remained within earshot of the concealed witnesses. Offer them the northern reservation lands, Forsyth urged quietly. It doesn't matter what we promise. Once the papers are signed, our men can provoke whatever incident we need to justify full removal. Judge Monroe nodded. The governor will accept my recommendation without question. By spring, the mining operations can begin. The territorial governor chose that moment to emerge from hiding, federal marshals at his side. I believe I would question such a recommendation quite thoroughly, Monroe, he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. The judge's face drained of color as Captain McGregor and his soldiers appeared from the cottonwoods. Forsyth reached for his gun, but froze when he found himself looking down the barrels of a dozen Army rifles. William Forsyth, Judge Everett Monroe, the governor announced formally, you are hereby detained on suspicion of conspiracy, corruption, and crimes against both citizens of this territory and the Apache Nation. The following days saw a flurry of activity in Copper Springs. With Forsyth and Monroe in custody, their co-conspirators quickly turned on each other, revealing the full extent of the plot. Thomas's ranch became temporary headquarters for the investigation, with Sarah tending to Nasha while territorial officials came to hear her testimony. Lieutenant Carey, arm in a sling but determined to see justice done, acted as translator. The young officer had risked his career and his life to stand against corruption, and Thomas had developed a deep respect for him. What will happen to Nasha now? Carey asked as they watched the child sitting on the porch with Sarah, learning to string beads despite her blindness. Chief Diablo has asked that she return to the tribe, Thomas replied. They consider her special now, touched by spirits. Her grandmother was their medicine woman, and they believe Nasha inherited her gifts. Carey nodded thoughtfully. And the silver deposits? Thomas smiled slightly. The governor has promised a new treaty that will allow the Apache to control their own resources. Any mining will require their permission and provide fair compensation. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, a rare instance of justice in a territory where might typically made right. As for Forsyth, Judge Monroe, and their accomplices, they would stand trial in the territorial capital, far from the influence they had cultivated in Copper Springs. On the day Nasha was to return to her people, Thomas found himself unexpectedly emotional. The child had endured unimaginable cruelty, yet maintained a quiet dignity that humbled him. Chief Diablo arrived personally to escort her home, bringing gifts of appreciation for Thomas and Sarah. Finely crafted buckskin garments and a ceremonial pipe that symbolized peace between them. As Nasha prepared to leave, she reached for Thomas's hand, speaking rapidly in Apache. Carey, standing nearby, translated with a smile. She says you have eyes that see both the land and the heart. Her people will remember the rancher who brought truth when others brought darkness. Thomas watched as Nasha rode away with Chief Diablo, her back straight and proud despite all she had suffered. The western sun cast long shadows across the land, a land where justice remained elusive, but was still worth fighting for. Thomas turned toward his ranch house, where Sarah waited on the porch. Some wounds never fully healed, he reflected, thinking of Nasha's permanent blindness. But even in the harsh reality of the frontier, where cruelty and greed often prevailed, there remained the possibility of redemption, not just for individuals, but for the soul of the territory itself. As he walked toward home, Thomas considered how a chance discovery in a remote ravine had changed everything. One child, one moment of compassion, had exposed corruption that might otherwise have destroyed an entire people. The West was still wild, still dangerous, but as long as men and women of conscience stood firm against injustice, there was hope for something better. Behind him, the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the endless sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. A fitting backdrop to the end of one chapter and the beginning of another in the ever-unfolding story of the American frontier.